we live in a much more nuanced, complex, and widespread divide, which won't be simply resolved with increased broadband and LTE additions. There's lots of grassroots efforts, as you know, so driven mainly by libraries, schools, and community organizations. There are great solutions on an individual and community level, but they're not always sustainable for everyone, and not obviously when we're faced with a crisis. So library internet access and education should be a bridge to community members as they need it, but long-term and more sustainable solutions are needed. So closing the digital divides, in 2019, the Canadian federal government said that it announced that 1.7 billion in funding was going to support high-speed internet in remote and rural areas. $1 billion is slated for the Universal Broadband Fund and for extending internet infrastructure. So that's 600 million for satellites, which could help connect some in remote and rural communities, and 85 million to top up the ongoing program called Connect to Innovate, which helps fund specific community projects in rural and First Nation communities. So, and the CRTC recommends that every household have access to broadband with download speeds of 50 megabytes per second, as we spoke about earlier in the presentation. And the federal government's goal is to have everyone at 50 megabytes per second by 2030. So infrastructure funding is a major part of getting Canada or any country connected. There's also inclusivity. So the introduction of costing caps. So that's a couple of initiatives that I read about. We have a new Democratic Party, and that was one of their platforms suggesting that we do have costing caps. Since we have a pretty small pool in the market, opening it up to alternative affordable options. Also hopeful that since many of the CEOs of the telecommunications giants were on that original task force, that they'd be open to alternative affordable options. And then there is education and helping those reach the digital proficiency that they need to navigate the digital world. So the educational levels, the political tolerance, and the degree of skepticism that they need, that can be done through ensuring that digital literacy is ingrained in our education system, also through awareness and advocacy. So solutions go beyond just the physical provision of internet broadband. Though it's a start, we need it to be more holistic. And I do provide a link to this paper. It did have fantastic solutions and suggestions for moving forward. So this is that task force that I mentioned earlier that published their report in 2001. I would also like to highlight some of the suggestions that were brought forward by the School of Public Policy in Saskatchewan. So the 4 things that all policy developers should consider when developing policy to close the digital divide is that participation in online world is a core principle of citizenship. The digital divide is beyond technological. It's spatial, temporal, and social. And that's been echoed in several of the presentations I've attended already today. And technical solutionism can temporarily bridge the gap, but it's not going to permanently close it. And finally, policy should reflect lessons from initiatives that have already enabled people, disadvantaged people, to pursue higher education while caring for their families. So use examples that have actually worked and then apply them to the solution in a more widespread manner. So as the Canadian Internet Registry Authority points out, providing better access is one thing, but giving people the tools and resources they need to become digitally literate and safe online is another issue altogether. So access, which we might have thought it was prior to the pandemic, will not close the digital divide. It's just a starting point.